Good evening, friends, and thank you for inviting me to give a little explanation of my work as manifested in my little article, Words, Language and Thoughts. I was, as everybody else, inspired by Ferdinand de Saussure, the Swiss linguist who invented a general science of language, la linguistique, in the beginning of the 20th century, and suggested something that has fascinated the linguists of the 20th century worldwide, to systematically distinguish the two aspects of language that he called la langue et la parole. La langue is language, a language seen as a system, and la parole, speech, or language seen as performance, as a manifestation by speaking or by writing and by being read or perceived as speech by a hearer. Now, that's fine. So the object of linguistics would be language as a system, centrally, and then there would be associated disciplines of study of side aspects. But the system of a language, the main subject of linguistics, would be a network of what? Well, of words defining a specific language, English or French or Wolof or Danish, my language. But the problem is that you could think of a language defined as a system of words, but when you look at the words of a language in a dictionary, you will not find any network, because words do not form a closed system, a finite network, like a paradigm of alternatives in Roman Jakobsen's version of paradigms that go into positions in a finite system of sequences called utterances. That's not the way it works, because words do not form a finite network. So how can we define linguistics, or what can we make of Saussure's intuition about language as a system? Maybe language isn't a system at all. Would that be bothering? Anyway, nobody has ever shown any language being a system. So, and there has been a lot of linguistics since the times of Saussure, a century ago. So maybe we don't need the idea of language being a system. Or if it is a system, in what sense could we make sense of the idea? Well, in my third slide, I show an idea taken from the stratification of linguistic structures seen by Louis Hjelmslev, the Danish linguist, in the 40s and the 50s. So you see language as consisting of units of different size. You have syllables and morphemes on the expressive side. You have intersyllabic lexemes. You have phrases, les syntagmes, syntagmatic units. Then you have sentences, les phrases in French. And then you have enunciations, which is something like utterances that can be many sentences long, of course, and integrate into a dialogue, for example. And then you have texts that are organized in pragmatic genres, monologue, dialogue, etc. On the content side, you have the meanings of the very small units, very often morphemes, in fact, namely flexives, inflexes, prefixes, postfixes, and so on, and the semantics of words, the semantics of phrase structure, the semantics of utterances, the semantics of text, of course, which is what we call discourse semantics, which go into the semantics of communicative acts. That's the content of pragmatics, in fact. So there is a long stretch from pragmatics and back down into the minimal units of syllabic signs. Those are, in general, morphemes. The interest of looking at this stratification is to see how the minimal units integrate into less minimal entities. So morphemes are attached to lexemes and determine the meaning and the form of the entities we call words. Morphemes also integrate into the phrase structure, like prepositions, for example, and case markers in sentences. In the level of sentences, you get paratactic and conjunctional markers like and but, and the adverbial articulators of the relation between sentences in utterances. In enunciation, you get, of course, both the shifters in Jacobson's sense, the personal pronouns, but also the deictic markers like here and now and tomorrow and yesterday, and also the vocatives like hey Joe. The hey is a morpheme, of course, but on the vocative level, where you also find a relation between those and prosodic organizations like intonations for questions, for orders, and so on. So that's a way of seeing it. So maybe you could say that since morphemes apply in this way to strata in language, maybe it would be an idea to say that la langue, the system of a language, is something that is the result of the systems of morphemes, because those do form finite paradigms in a language. Like prepositions, they do not come and go, but form a closed class of words. Whereas lexemes like table, chair, computer, mouse, etc., form an infinite list of words in a semantic domain. And of course, you can't make a system in any axiomatic sense of an infinite list. So that's something that comes close to what I have to propose, in fact, that the stratification of structure in language gives morphemes a central role as an integrator and a unifier of the strata that form a language. Also, morphemes are high frequency markers of structure. So the syllables that are the expressions or the signifiers of morphemes are highly frequent, much more frequent than in a text, in whatever text. than the open class words. So we might, I'm looking at slide 4 here, try to define a language by its morphemes, in fact. When the morphemes of a language change, then we might see a language changing thereby. Would be interesting to see if that hypothesis could be generalized. Now, anyway, words comprise two parts. They consist of roots and flexives, you will say. I call the roots lexemes and the flexives morphemes. So an ordinary word like horses has a morpheme for the plural in English, and then the rest is a root, a lexeme. That's very common. Subordinate has ord as a root, and sub and innate as morphemes around it. Most words have a composition, both of lexemes and morphemes, but they can also be either a lexeme without morpheme or morphemes only. Lexemes, open class words, express categories. That is, the content of an open class lexeme is a reference to some concept of an entity that is recognized by thought somewhere. Whereas the content of the entities we call closed class words, like prepositions, conjunctions, genitive marks, plural marks, and so on, express schemas. So there is a schema for plural, a schema for genitive, etc. Sometimes more than one schema for one signifier, morpheme signifier. But that's not a very serious problem, I think. It's just a matter of homosemy and pluralisemy. So lexemes constitute expressions of categories, and morphemes are the expressions of schemas. And those are basic cognitive categories. So, for example, the lexematic categories for animal has a subcategory horse and a subcategory, for example, mar. Tool, hammer, gavel is a sort of hierarchy organization that we find in all domains, all semantic domains of experience: furniture, table, console, etc. And for each of these categories, for example, hammer has a central prototype and often has peripheral hybrid tokens. So something that looks like a hammer but can also be used for other purposes. Something that looks like a telephone but is also a computer and can be used as a TV and whatever is a sort of hybrid token. But that's normal because in language we don't define categories like we do in artificial discourse, like philosophy, where we can create new categories according to the needs of a theory. We don't define categories in life. We just have them and develop them naturally out of a prototype, a named prototype, and then we allow this prototype to have tokens that are more or less central. So they can be peripheral, and in the periphery you get a fuzzy boundary. Categories inform terminologies, okay, You can say that's what Saussure saw when he distinguished mutton and sheep. Sheep is an animal, and mutton is the same animal, but served on the table after a gastronomic elaboration. They form terminologies, but they don't form closed networks. So categories cannot define languages, of course, unless we define language by a collection of core categories, which has also been proposed, especially by Greenberg. Morphematic schemas, what I mean by schema here is the relational structure that organize thinking by language. Simple example, from and to, two preposition in English. Here's a schema to the left in slide 6 for from, namely you have something, an entity that exists through time and space. And through time, you see a bifurcation happen, and there is something that comes from it. So you would say Q comes from P in this example. And to would be something like the direction of Q in the schema to the right, which is an inversion of the first one. So here you have a Q that is going towards and to. The train to Paris. You have Paris as a baseline here, and you have Q going there. That's a sort of mental diagram for thinking, and you can fill in with all sort of categories for the entities that are co-organized by the schemas, and that's how you get meaning. Another example, quantifiers, of course. If all P's are have the quality Q, then they are in the sort of little yard guarded by a dynamic boundary. So it means that if there is an element of P that escapes, it will be caught and brought back, so that all P's are guarded inside. If you say that some P's are Q quality, then you see some inside the yard and others that are outside, maybe because they escaped, or maybe they are on their way in or out. There are different possibilities, but that's the basic schema. Whereas the negative version is that none of them are inside and all are outside. So you get the same schema, but in 3 variations. That's normal for schemas, that they are little machines that can be imagined, visualized mentally in different positions. And that's why you get small paradigms. Here's a paradigm of quantifiers, a very short one. All, some, none, tout, quelque, aucun. I think this has to do with the schemas for negation also. And of course, the study of schemas constitutes a huge and very fascinating domain for semantic research. Now, linguistic structure can be seen as an array of structures, in fact, and all are related to words in the sense we just saw. Now, we have a lexical morphology. Of course, we have an infinite list of roots, but then we have finite lists for morphology, which go into syntax when you get the compositional structures, tree structures if you want, dependency structures that organize the relations between verb, subject, object, indirect object, adverbials, prepositional phrases, and embedded propositions and so on in what we call grammar. That depends on words, of course. Words are, by the way, the only instances that everybody can hold in consciousness. whereas most of spoken grammar remains automatic and unconscious to the speaker, and also to the hearer, by the way. Now, sentence semantics is the immediate meaning you get out of understanding a sentence. Of course, it depends on knowing the words in the sentence, and also it depends on how you mentalize the meaning of each of the components. But it depends also on syntax, of course. If Peter loves Mary or Mary loves Peter, that's not the same sentence semantic content. Phonetics is of course a matter of linearization of syntactic structures. Now, syntactic structures, if they are dependency structures, are not linear, but they are spatial. But they have to be projected onto a phonetic timeline, which can also be a space line in writing. So phonetic structure cannot be reduced to syntactic structure at all. It's an autonomous mechanism or structure that articulates syllables of the words according to their proximity by syntax into units that are unified by intonation or by scriptural strategies that compete with intonation. Discourse semantics, on the other hand, is independent of sentence syntax, but of course unfold the encyclopedic background of the words used in a sentence. And sentence semantics can only show the meaning of words sentence by sentence. So when the sentences are ambiguous, then the discourse semantics has to clear up the ambiguities. And when sentences are linked together, of course, discourse semantics has to unfold a meaning that can be shared by the contents of each sentence. Now, discourse semantics is absolutely essential for coherence in speech. And it's also dependent on the fifth component or structural mechanisms I have to integrate into the spiral that constitutes the new model for linguistic meaning, namely enunciation. Now, enunciation is the structure that contains an organization of the deictic nature. I am addressing you and I want you to know something. So I say something to you, and that something will tell you something about some part of reality. Now, I address you in order to tell you something, authorized by what? Well, something like where I speak from, as the philosopher Michel Foucault said. You have to speak from somewhere. Now, I speak from philosophy or from linguistics or from whatever experience, or because I represent some group of people or whatever. So I am normally authorized to do that by a reference to an instance that has been showing me something, which I now show you so that you can show it to other people again. You see, this mechanism can distinguish I from we, or from an impersonal institutional address, and it can speak down to you or speak up to you or speak, to you as a woman or as a man or as a child, etc. Enunciation has a specification which is coded in language. All languages have microscopic, sometimes, codings that organize speech as a structure for communication between people. And of course, when I speak, when you speak, when everybody speaks, there is an enunciational structure involved, which can also be heard in phonetics. So it's projected from the semantics of enunciation to the performance that makes the expression a living manifestation of in a human intention to communicate something. In fact, this model on slide 8 is a summary of a new linguistic theory, namely that both for speaking and for hearing, for producing language and for receiving language, these instances are linked together in something like this way. Now here is enunciation. In the middle, I am showing you P1, P2, first person, second person. That's a signifier, symbolized by SA, since Saussure called it a signifier. And this signifier will tell you that, which is the signified, explicit meaning. So the signifier is also a person, namely that will tell you something. But it can only tell you something if the signified meaning, SE, refers back to a reference or a common ground which is presupposed when I open my mouth and say that I am showing you something, because I am first me being spoken to by some authority A that is informing me about a certain domain, which I called reference, and about a certain concern in that area. That's what we call a common ground. Yeah, so that's the simplest version of the basic structure in enunciation as I see it. There are many other analyses of this phenomenon, especially in French semiotics and linguistics, but here's my version. In syntax, if a sentence like the one I took from Félix Fénéon, who wrote a remarkable book, well, he wrote the contents of that book that came out essentially after his death as a posthumous novel of novels in 3 lines, nouvelles en 3 lignes. In fact, not novels, but stories in 3 lines. So here's a 3-line story from a newspaper in the beginning of the 20th century. It was published in a newspaper in Paris. In a café on Rue Fontaine, Vautour, Lenoir, and Athanas exchanged a few bullets regarding their wives who were not present. That's the whole story. So you see the verb, you see the subjects, Vautour, Lenoir, and Athanas, and you see the object, which is called node number 3 here, for reasons I don't want to go into in this presentation. I take this format for syntax from what I call a stemmatic syntax, which is a version of Tenier's accent-based syntax. And you see the adverbials, and you see that the adverbials have 2 levels, a content level regarding something, namely their wives. And you see a little relative clause within that phrase. And then you see at last a locative structure with some nominal sub-articulations. That's a nice little sentence which form the syntactic expression, we could still call it, for a scenario where we see some persons exchange some objects, negative objects, namely bullets, from pistols, I suppose. So they were exchanging bullets, namely they were shooting at each other in this cafe. So here is a Gramscian version of sentence semantics, explaining the schematic content of the scenario of these persons shooting at each other. The bullets are the objects and the subjects are the agents involved. And there is, of course, in an exchange and equivalence, bullet for bullet, right? That's how exchanges work. And also, you need to know what an offense is. We don't know what the offense is, but we have to interpolate semantics taken from the encyclopedic discourse side, the open instance of discourse semantics, in order to link the offense to what is called their wives. So imagine these guys sitting there and having some drinks and then starting to offend each other's wives. Your wife is a bitch, etc. So is yours, etc. And on until they start shooting at each other, because such a wife-centered offense needs, of course, reparation. And the repair is done by shooting. So it could be, the sentence could be a police report. But you see the scenario, and that's my point here, namely that this illustrates what language does. It creates semantic units of that kind. So we have sentence semantics and discourse semantics. You could, for example, if this is a literary text, an entire literary text, you are entitled to go on interpreting it until it takes on a meaning about human behavior in general in this world, and it becomes very philosophical at the end. Now, in slide 12, what the sentence means is represented as a categorized schema of a scenario, right? The scenario of these French monsieur shooting in the cafe. And what is meant is, of course, that a peaceful place like a cafe can be a battleground and transformed in such a horrible thing by language. So beware of what you are saying, etc. Despite the drinking, respect your partners in dialogue, and be responsible, or something like that. Or literally speaking, see what people do because they can. They can't do that because language is too dangerous for them. So from language to pistols, you have exchanges. You see. So my conclusion here is simply that you might understand language as a vocabulary with typical unfoldings that relate every word used by its morphemes, by the morphemes of that language that forms the internal context of every word used in that language, to grammar, to phonetics, to sentence semantics, and to discourse semantics, and to enunciation. So, in fact, what's happening in sentence semantics is that language relates to a cognitive capacity we have for imagination. We have to imagine that scenario. It relates to our capacity to control our grammar. It costs a little work to do so, but if you do that, then you can control your language somehow and somewhat. That's called rhetoric. And watch your tongue when you speak, because you can do that because you can do a little bit of grammar. And also, words are, of course, related directly to thought. That's what happens when the concept of offense is unfolded behind the sentence scenario, the sentence semantic scenario, right? And also, the word structure here is manifested in enunciation. Something like, where is the narrator? Is the text using morphemes from the present or from the past, etc.? Does it present itself in a sort of conjunctive form or directly, or does it manifest questions or imperatives and so on? That's the enunciational part. And then it's performed according to enunciation, which is connected directly to discourse semantic thought, to sentence semantic imagination, to syntactic structure of grammar, and to the performance in either the oral or the graphic version of performance, in both cases by a transposition into body language, because gesture is present both in writing, you can say, and in speech. So my conclusion is that if that is a relevant representation of how language works, then we should not be too categorical about the distinction of language system from language use, because it's the use-based grammar that manifests or allows us to reconstruct the structures of the components here, namely phonetics, syntax, semantics in sentence terms, and semantics in discourse terms, encyclopedic semantics, enunciation, and then back to performance. That's the use of language that allows us to do that. In the middle, we have something that we can reconstruct theoretically as the language as a system, but only out of the use, of course. And since language is a moving, living, almost an animal, it lives, then we have to not be too categorical either about a distinction between synchronic and diachronic dimensions of language. It lives in time, and time is both time of the history of languages, philology, and of the immediate structure of some language, which would be like the synchronic aspect, of course. Distinctions that Saussure insisted a lot upon. But I think that the most important thing now here is to see how we can understand the little machines that surround words and allow them to do what they are doing as manifestators of language and the main means of communication between human beings. So that's essentially what I had to explain in that text, and now I'm explaining it to you. Thank you very much.